Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining the ISF Bright Talk channel today. I'm Francesca, Research Analyst at the ISF, and I'm here with Sam Parker, Solutions Engineering Manager at OneTrust, to discuss third-party risk. Before I hand over to Sam, there are a few housekeeping items to cover off. This presentation will last approximately 45 minutes, and then we'll open the floor to a question and answer session. Please make sure you type any questions in the question box on your screen. All viewers are automatically muted by webinar administrators, and if you're experiencing any technical difficulties, please leave the webinar and dial back in. Finally, this session will be recorded and available on demand on the ISF Live Bright Talk channel. I hope that you enjoy this webinar, and I'll be now handing you over to Sam. Thank you.
Great, thanks Francesca. Hi everyone, lovely to talk to you all today. As Francesca mentioned, my name is Sam Parker, and I manage our solutions engineering team for the North Americas market, as well as supporting the European market for our GRC and security assurance cloud, as well as our third-party management cloud that the OneTrust platform provides. So today I'll be talking you through optimizing third-party risk, how we enhance automation with an integrated IT risk platform. There are three key fundamentals that I really want to highlight in today's presentation as we go through this over the next 45 to 50 minutes or so before we open up to questions. So the first piece is we're going to diagnose and understand how vendor risk dependencies are distributed throughout your organization's risk program. From there, we'll take a look at how we reduce manual data management across risk domains and to leadership. And then finally, we're going to prioritize engagements with your most critical vendors based on IT risk indicators. One of the key critical takeaways I hope that everyone obtains from today's presentation is how siloed IT risk and security teams and siloed third-party management supply chain teams can use integrated and centralized platforms in order to be able to see the initiatives across those two different areas or those multiple different areas of the organization and be able to get critical business insights and critical risk information associated to the individual practices of those particular teams. We'll start by stating the obvious. Our third-party risk footprint has continued to grow as businesses have continued to engage with more vendors and third-party suppliers. 71% of organizations have more third parties in their network than they did a year ago. And the same percentage of these businesses anticipate that numbers continue to grow. In fact, the median organization contracts 5,000 third parties. With the Internet of Things environment and the digitization of business, this has expanded the prevalence of third-party risks horizontally across almost every business function. Now, on this note as well, we do actually have a poll in the Bright Talk platform. And the question is your third-party risk management program well integrated with your broader risk infrastructure program, right? And if you think about the footprint of third parties within the organization today, I hope that sparks some thought, and I encourage everybody to answer the poll as we go through today's conversation in terms of how your organization fits into some of the key points that we'll be touching on in today's presentation. One of the reasons security is so critical to third-party risk management today is the market has expanded beyond traditional supply chain planning. There is not a single department in the business that does not operate through a third-party system of some sort. The IT vendor risk of choice today is brought to you by Bright Talk, for example, right? So even in today's conversation, ISF and OneTrust are working through a third party. Again, I encourage everyone in the audience to think about all the different third-party platforms and all the different third-party interactions that you're having just simply with the next hour or two of your day-to-day work. Third-party risk already takes a very horizontal perspective of analyzing the business internally, as well as vendor operations. But this has been significantly escalated by digital transformation and the recent acceleration stemming from the pandemic. Not a direct correlation that your the vendor list is getting longer. There is a lot of opportunity with new market entries for vendor consolidation. The nature of a software as a service-based expansion has emphasized the importance of third-party information security at scale. But we continue to see in practice a lot of interesting factors associated with this. There's a somewhat fragmented perspective of third-party risks in most industries and most organizations that we speak to. Ultimately, third-party risk has to wear a lot of hats and has to engage across broader business to assess what the risk is in line with, in order to make sure it's in line with the value of the internal function. One of the challenges here is that there are a variety of perspectives or risk domains to consider. Traditionally, third-party contracting and risk evaluation has been a procurement-driven exercise. It's a process-orientated discipline to ensure primarily that legal and financial interests are upheld. So onboarding this perspective is executed in lockstep with legal mandates that the business is required to operate under. A large number of the businesses on the line have invested in OneTrust to streamline privacy compliance across privacy compliance, risk compliance, third-party compliance, environmental sustainability compliance, as well as quantified risk management across your internal and external networks. Again, there are a lot of perspectives here. One of the most pressing issues at the moment for strategic planning is what's my environmental, societal, and governance risk. Something that's been a pressing concern that often isn't in the purview of procurement, but is in the purview of another team, is your IT and your security risk. What are the latest updates from this particular third party and from their particular market that will impact the organization? So it's up to the third-party risk team to evaluate various aspects of a partner's organization to understand how they may increase or decrease a risk to the related business function, leveraging the product or service within their own internal organization. The challenge here is balancing these perspectives across the comprehensive analysis of vendor management. What happens in a lot of instances is that third-party risk management is driven as a procurement initiative or a reaction to legislation, rather than in a holistic or integrated manner that we can easily share knowledge across different teams, specifically in my examples across security, which is a foundational element of assessing third-party risk today. So even programs where automation has been adopted in some aspects of the business, such as automating our vendor assessment touchpoints or curating and tracking due diligence intelligence through a vendor exchange, other adjacent areas of the business are still operating in a very manual way, with complicated communication channels or even overlap in common tooling. That is a common inefficiency we see. But regardless of where the data is, whether it's in a spreadsheet or siloed in an application, the result is you'll typically find redundant data sets. One big issue is that we have two teams duplicating efforts, but beyond those teams operating efficiently, you run the risk of having variations of the truth, quote unquote truth, and ultimately it's very easy to lose sight of the bigger picture. Cyber risk and software as a service landscapes continue to evolve in every business. One of the things that we're here to talk about today, of course, is how to enhance third-party risk through an integrated IT and security risk management solution. So let's take a look at this from that lens. So the cyber risk and software as a service landscape is a fun, interesting place to be. It's at least one of those things. We can also see it is a very complicated place to be. You'll see that in another stat here in just a second. We hit a new record high in 2021 of the number of data breaches. According to Identity Theft Resource Center, it jumped 68% from 2020, the previous high being in 2017. No coincidence as well, we've seen an uptick in work from home initiatives and also digitization for companies that may have had a more traditional landscape across different markets and regions as they were forced into more digitized processes over the last 2 years of the pandemic. The amount of data and connectivity that we have today is a complicated cyber landscape. It comes down really to speed, scale, and sprawl. IT risk teams and third-party risk teams alike are having to track down and assess a sprawling IT ecosystem as more and more departments adopt solutions to gain productivity and scale the enterprise. But this makes tracking or identifying the parameters of your locations a real challenge. It's a heavy investigative load to inventories of business systems, and we're not even referencing shadow IT here, just the known edge of your known business applications. Then we have concepts of shrinking of the overall boom. The place at which we're executing, exploiting is faster than ever, and vulnerabilities are no exception. Threat actors and channels are sophisticated. We think about worst case scenarios, zero-day vulnerabilities like the Log4j incident from just a couple of months ago now. The timeline was was so condensed from when the vulnerability was socialized to Apache's response, and the reports of exploitation a few hours between the events seem to be in record place. The lessons learned and the net of what this means to business is that we need to be well positioned for the proactive response of these particular instances. And we've also seen legislation come out about this previously. Industries are passing legislation to implement accountability and notification requirements for cyber incidents, because currently there is no macro level understanding of how to effectively ascertain the location and the existence of hackers and threat agents and how they are performing. Many other businesses also suffer from the same lockup of other large breach events that we've seen across the last 2 years. Each of these factors really emphasizes the need to integrate and automate the approach for both the IT risk and security teams as well as the third-party risk management teams. So who drives third-party risk management? What are their priorities? How do we collaborate? What you see here on the screen is not an exhaustive list of priorities by any stretch of the imagination, but simply some of the key focus elements that will, of course, vary from business to business and industry to industry. But they are present within each domain. These are traditional elements of risk management and, more importantly, risk reduction. Third-party risk management is not always a direct component of information security, but you cannot effectively perform an information security assessment in today's risk ecosystem without insights from the third-party risk management team or process or system. The nature of IT risk and third-party risk are more critical than ever. But if you're reporting on these elements separate from one another, there may be a lot of missing context. Often we can get caught up by external drivers such as legal compliance mandates. This is one of the biggest splinters to fragmenting how we manage risk holistically in the business. A lot of this is because of resources and general bandwidth. Excuse me. We're constantly trying to move bigger, faster, stronger, and in the perspective of risk, taking the path of least resistance to get there, but this really does require a bigger picture perspective. You cannot adequately account for information security risk without accounting for third-party information security risk. And conversely, as broader IT strategies change in InfoSec policy and priorities, these can all influence who we focus on for vendor risk as our priority or our tiering of vendors. And this is a great opportunity for synergies between the IT and the third-party risk team, sharing data from the IT risk function to help inform and reinforce who our tier one or critical vendors are based on our broader IT ecosystem, their associated risks, and their associated business functions. So if you look at the screen here, as an IT risk manager or a key information security or system owner, some of my responsibilities would include mapping scope of exposure, supporting security operations, tracking criticality, and managing the residual risk, the life cycle of that risk management over time. There's a good amount of overlap between that and the functions of the third-party risk team. Third-party risk team owns the relationship to evaluate the risk factors across two or multiple parties. Due diligence is critical in order to ensure a tried and true procurement practice for any vendor onboarding, evaluation, and action. Planning, collecting, and disseminating risk intelligence across market sources, as well as from vendors directly. Critical aspect of my role if I was in third-party risk. And one of the main things to note here is being thorough without holding up the business. Timely contacting and contracting to start realizing added value from an outsourced perspective or service is something that leadership understands clearly. So a rhetorical question to the audience. Would love to hear, what is your confidence levels of alignment between IT and third-party risk? Now, we do have a chat available in the platform that we're using today, so feel free to post those in the chat here. I would love to hear your feedback on what level of alignment or what is your confidence level in how aligned your IT and third-party risk teams are, and how often are they both engaged at the same time with tier one SaaS providers. Now, the reason I mentioned that this was kind of a rhetorical question is some of these areas are going to be highlighted in terms of what OneTrust has seen across the market as we both present our product to market and also work directly with our existing customers and clients in implementing this solution for bespoke business practices. Both IT and third-party risk management share common objectives, as we saw earlier, and have a number of synergies across the risk assessments and internal risk evaluations that you may be performing. But as risk becomes more and more specialized, cross-functional collaboration can take a lot of time, energy, and work. We opened up today's session really highlighting the needs for enhanced risk resources because we're dealing with more vendors and more data operating at a very fast pace. This is a really big challenge when it comes to proactively sharing and collaborating across risk teams, because priority number one is getting the must-haves done. This is the people part of this particular process. Now, different teams are driven by compliance requirements and business objectives. For example, reporting on the GDPR privacy initiatives in the European Union versus information security organization compliance, versus internal InfoSec compliance versus financial risk requirements, right? These are often going to be the must-haves, the must-to-dos for many organizations. Often what we find when doing third-party risk is that we have a number of different lenses of the same supply, and doing is probably the wrong term there. It is the wrong term there. We are not doing third-party risk. We are executing initiatives and procedures to identify risks associated with third parties and reduce those corresponding risks. Because a lot of different areas of the business need guidance from the third-party risk team in order to achieve a lot of these compliance initiatives. Now, next is the overall requirement on how unique different teams are. Process, product, or service changes. There is a reason that specialized teams for both third-party risk and IT risk have been developed, because the way you engage with external organizations is inherently different to the way in which you engage with everyday line and business managers. And just very quickly here, team, I'm just going to double check my connection. I just got a notification. Francesca, do you just mind just giving me a quick okay that everything's coming through nice and clearly? I just got a warning from the BrightTalk platform.
Yeah, everything is perfect.
Okay, wonderful, wonderful. All righty, so let's move on to the next piece here. So information sharing relates to two specific areas. One area is the third party's willingness and ability to share information, data, security controls, knowledge, certifications in order for the third party risk team to conduct an assessment. The difference between a good third party risk team and a great one is that information sharing takes place from you back to the business. So we can create effective communication channels through these different teams that cater to your functional needs and establish a foundation. The ODI recently completed a survey across UK businesses and found that about only 27% of those surveyed are sharing data proactively. This is the sum across both internal and external stakeholders. For those who reported proactively sharing data, the top three benefits were cited as improved collaboration with stakeholders and partners, 38%, better service and product delivery at 36%, and legal compliance at 34%. Businesses are striving for analytics and insights to inform strategic decisions, but without the foundation or correlated data points, it simply cannot be achieved. Gartner has done data analytics, and analytics leaders have looked into this data and have externally seen that organizations generate 3 times more measurable economic benefits than those that don't implement these particular data points. So this moves us into beyond just the diagnosis of this issue, into the areas associated to how we can start to prove this internally within the organization. Now, how will IT risk management reinforces risk practices for an overall enterprise or company-wide set of risk insights can be broken down into 4 key areas. Efficiently mapping to the overall enterprise business objectives and existential and strategic risks within the organization. Streamlining IT compliance and reporting. optimizing IT risk and control assessments, both internally and externally, and then finally being able to manage cyber risk to reduce your attack surface. And that's a key thing to think about when we think about the expanse of our attack surface as we incorporate more and more third parties, fourth parties, fifth parties. The attack surface continues to grow as we incorporate more and more third-party products and services. Now, we'll get into the meat of today's presentation in this next piece as well. Now, identifying the synergies from an operational standpoint is where IT risk and TPRM can both help optimize the automation in your third-party risk management program, giving extra business context to the third-party risk that the organization faces from a reporting perspective. I'll start with highlighting some of the standout areas where TPRM has a unique depth. They have the ability to plan and document due diligence plans. Part of this is a structured and guided workflow to track and document intelligence. Another piece of it is sourcing the information where vendors are able to aggregate data points to inform inherent risk or vendor assessments. Then, of course, it's the ability to facilitate controlled information sharing with external parties. How to make risk assessments as frictionless as possible between third parties and internal teams while getting the most accurate and complete information, whether that's through a portal, an exchange, an assessment, or a limited access type of view. This is vital to third-party risk because once information is shared, how do you actually confirm deletion? We also need the ability to track engagements holistically to assess the totality of products and services provided by a single third party. It's all well and good to be able to assess an organization at the organization level, but they may provide very, very dramatically different services with different levels of criticality to the business objectives and also different levels of risk to the organization. And lastly, here is where a third-party risk capability can also work in being able to capture key documents and key data points that are very often static in nature, but you need to stay ahead of such contract terms and expiration dates from a procurement and a supply chain standpoint. But on the other hand, IT risk needs the ability to track and complete IT ecosystem product launches and initiatives for SaaS-based companies, software development lifecycle initiatives, IT projects, assets, business processes. From there, we're using these data points to assess risk and criticality to again prioritize mitigation action. Control management mitigation efforts based on IT audits and assurance are often another key critical value add of the IT risk function. The IT risk management team needs to understand where my gaps are and be the ones to manage and track remediation to protect the business, ensuring that a control is applied across all the relevant business assets and processes. And then lastly, we talked about the speed, scale, and sprawl of data. And really this applies to risk as well as the threats and vulnerabilities that make up that risk. Since risk is fluid in nature, so having the ability to tap into key threats and vulnerabilities that could culminate in that risk being realized is a critical piece of IT risk management, and needing an incident response plan or a mitigation plan in order to reduce said risk. Sometimes when we get into the risk management world, we get guilty of thinking about risk as an object. Risk is a very, very fluid concept, and a risk never ceases to exist, but rather we mitigate the overall impact to that organization and take steps in order to reduce the probability that it occurs. And that's obviously going to be a much more focused discipline on the IT security side than what we typically see on the third-party management side. The vendor team, of course, has the insights into helping IT risk understand the extent or edge of your attack surface to manage residual risk. Once a vendor assessment is complete and you've made recommendations back to the business, what is the life cycle of that risk? How do we measure it within the broader risk tolerances of the organization? How do we identify the fluctuations across those variables? And could we trigger points to the third-party risk management team in order to be able to create actions at an external facing level? In summary, IT risk management needs to be the frontline resource, and IT is already assessing the risk. But in many cases, the third-party risk management team defaults to that frontline resource, just simply given the nature of their day-to-day operations. So how do we start to operationalize this? 3 key areas of common ground here. Streamlined risk assessments are critical across both functions. Sharing and collaborating on assessment templates to ensure and reinforce that you're capturing the entire picture. For security and IT information security teams, they should be part of the collaborative process of this particular assessment capability, because they are needing to ask the business the same questions to prove compliance across various standards, as well as to mitigate risk effectively. While the third-party management team is exposed to the same requirements, but their overall objectives often expand across more operational, supply chain, and financial endeavors, as well as obviously taking security into consideration. The next piece here that has a lot of commonalities is the ability to create dynamic workflows that incorporate both areas of the business's requirements that are unique, while also creating efficiencies across the areas of these two groups that are identical or similar. What I mean by this is flexible workflows can help guide the unique processes for a third-party risk management team or the IT risk mitigation and lifecycle management. When we think about procurement versus information security, flexible workflows allow you to leverage out of the box designs, where I can use similar but multiple workflows across these different initiatives that both teams can utilize. A tool that you create these workflows through needs to be able to easily customize based on existing risks that are identified by different business actors and streamlined across these different groups. This is also an area where you can use standardization to help emphasize synergies and efficiencies between the tier 1 vendors, the critical assets that they provide, and the IT work streams that these internal IT groups are looking to utilize. And a good example of this is something like the Standard Information Gathering Organization that provides specific third-party objectives in their standard assessments, while also incorporating many of the different factors that an IT team needs to understand in order to effectively assess an asset provided by a third party. And the last piece here is really the synergies around centralized insights. As you probably noticed, streamlining is the name of the game here. I've said it a few times through different ways in this presentation, but often the information you need to find or produce exists already in a different part of the business. And leveraging a common platform is how we're able to streamline this. Who, what, where. That is achieved by a common platform. Simply identifying the other risk stakeholders that may already have the information sounds simple when I say it out loud. It can be very complex across all the different business units or teams. An individual human brain or an individual human team is unable to have the bandwidth to be able to go through and identify that every day, all day. For instances of evaluating residual risk to the business, this isn't really something that third-party risk management owns, but will influence how you engage that vendor in the future. So let's drill down now into a little bit more detail around the assessment piece of the 3 areas that I called out. Streamline the maintenance of our assessments is the first key point here. A platform like OneTrust allows you to validate and maintain a common set of templates. From a security perspective, you need to ensure that you're holding your internal business accountable for the same level of security. The same foundational questions are being asked across audiences. Let's look at streamline, not just the actual data we're collecting. Let's look at efficiencies, not just the actual data we're collecting, right? But also having a commonality across those assessments allows us to be able to identify what data is being collected, what data is being executed against, what areas of the business are exposed to different processes that vendor provides. We also need to validate the source of that particular information, right? So I want to know exactly whether or not certain responses are coming from third-party teams, fourth-party organizations and sub-service providers that provide services to the third-party asset that's critical. And then I want to be able to summarize all that information in meaningful risk data, quantified so that the IT risk team and the third-party risk team are able to speak the same common language and be able to identify that this is a particular risk to the business. We don't have 2 completely siloed processes to identify, quantify, and communicate that particular risk. The next piece is ready to use workflows. And of course, workflows can be used to describe a lot of different functions in the business. But what a platform like OneTrust can do is it can start to represent those workflows using automated triggers and using certain data points coming into the system to advance the workflow along and bring in additional stakeholders into the user interface. What happens with risk once a vendor assessment is done is often it's filed away and collects virtual dust. You hand it off to the business, and then IT risk may ensure that a mitigation plan is put in place in more mature organizations. But even then, you see that it's kind of a one-time event through the procurement process. What a platform like OneTrust allows us to do is make this a life cycle concept where we're continuously monitoring and mitigating risks as elements of the third party, of the overall business environment, and of the internal organization change over time. Various elements of functions of governance, risk, and compliance, or even just information security, it doesn't have to be as broad as governance, risk, and compliance, have their own lifecycle management processes within the broader ecosystem of GRC. Risks, policies, incidents, vendors are some of the more common and established practices, and it's important to explore what resources are available within these specific domains. For example, risk remediation, policy development, vendor onboarding, tracking IT risk and third-party risk activities on a common platform and in a standardized manner can help you go beyond the point-in-time exercises to understand the health or performance of your program over time to see where the needles are for moving our risk profile in the correct mitigated direction. Now, the next piece here, and probably the piece that's probably the heaviest of the three in terms of its concepts, is going to be around standardizing risk to measure business performance. Now, this is a piece that is really even in the purview of a lot of organizations we talk to and work with. Excuse me, sorry, I'm just going to sneeze. Give me 1 second. So this particular area, this particular function is an area that is often not within the purview of multiple teams. A lot of individual teams in businesses and organizations that OneTrust works with think about this in the silo perspective of their different organizations. There's often an enterprise risk team, an IT risk team, a vendor risk team, a financial risk team. They all have their different methods to actually measure and profile and quantify risk within the organization. But they often fall into the trap of not speaking the same common language. And they also fall into the trap of not having all the data points they need to effectively quantify that risk. And so it becomes a bit of an exercise of garbage in, garbage out, or fake mathematics. One of the biggest challenges in how we operationalize risk management is in the subjectivity of the score. And what I mean by score is, right, I have a particular range of probability or frequency that risk occur, a particular range of the impact often measured in dollars or euros or pounds. The problem is it can be guilty of being incredibly subjective. So when we think about centralizing insights, so using an integrated platform where we can work towards standardizing risk or normalizing risk, this is the way you have the foundation to translate risk from one domain to another. So I'll give you an example here. So privacy compliance is really focused on PII or personal information, and based on a vendor's practices and controls in place, there may be additional risk factors to consider. But then the information security team is tracking this as a high risk based on the fact that it's okay that this information is not personally identifiable. But we've input some proprietary data, potentially our own intellectual property across this channel. This is one, and so it has broader risk implications beyond the privacy focus of PII. So a privacy team would flag that risk at a certain particular level, right? And so if a particular system or a database does not contain PII, I, as a privacy professional, may flag that as a low risk. I may use a qualitative low score. Meanwhile, my IT security team is considering this a critical asset because of that intellectual property and that proprietary data that is in that asset. Maybe the asset is part of a critical function, and they may consider it much higher risk. They may also be using a totally different language. They may consider this a score of 25 on a particular spectrum of probability versus impact. And then you'll have your third-party risk management team that looks at the overall perhaps dollar spend and the exposure of that particular third party to other sub-service providers and other markets and other regions and other jurisdiction requirements. And they may score it in a totally different way again. You need a system like OneTrust in order to be able to make sure that those, in this example, 3 different teams are scoring those risks in a way that is all encompassing of all those different initiatives, while then also being able to break down the individual threats, vulnerabilities, risks associated to those individual requirements, and have kind of sub-scores or summary scores for those different initiatives within the organization. Trying to achieve that on a spreadsheet and trying to achieve that through communication via our common communication channels like Teams, Slack, email is not scalable. And you need a centralized governance, risk and compliance tool or digital trust tool like OneTrust in order to be able to effectively communicate that data and that information across those teams in the same language. I look at risk scoring the same way as I look at languages around the world, right? I'm fluent in English. I've got in 3 different English-speaking countries, and I can get by and ordering at a restaurant in Spain or in Latin America, right? I wouldn't be able to, for example, effectively communicate, let's say, in Germany. I'm not fluent in German. So it is, if I am trying to identify a critical area of my life and someone is communicating that to me in German, it's going to be very difficult for me able to process the totality of what they are trying to deliver to me in terms of information. The same concept is exactly the same with risk, right? Low, medium, high, quantified scores that are more qualitative across a range of probability versus impact, full formula, Monte Carlo and fair analyses used by the teams. Those are so different in their outputs that the actual totality of the threat, the totality of the impact of the organization, the totality of the mitigation procedures and the resources needed to reduce that risk is completely lost if privacy, third-party management, InfoSec, or all the other examples I've given throughout the presentation are not speaking that same common language. So it's important to be able to implement a common methodology, right? I think that's fairly clear. The next step, of course, is to take a more dynamic and data-driven approach with aspects of risk formulas where we can use indicators across different domains to calculate real-time scores. This allows for accounting for implications around context of the data, such as in this example, private personal information versus confidential data that I mentioned earlier. Having a tool like OneTrust allows us to reduce the manual data management across those different risk domains and manage the manual and incomplete information that we then provide to leadership and stakeholders. So where do we start evaluating that these 3 vendors provide, 3 groups provide value to the organization, right? This happens with the vendor onboarding, but who does this assessment, who owns this assessment after the initial procurement? Typically, IT risk is responsible for that evaluation, and they're often also responsible for the process or asset risk to the business. There's a few different levels of risk associated to this particular activity, and one of which I want to highlight here is process level risk. This will be the residual risk after a vendor is onboarded, and how that residual risk fluctuates and how the business changes or grows in using that service or that asset. If we consider a common metric that many security teams use here, or not metric, concept, breaking that risk down into confidentiality, integrity, and availability areas, ultimately what this does is it means that this product or service is no longer perhaps available or no longer perhaps containing data that is has integrity, is accurate, or perhaps has exposure to areas of the business that removes its confidentiality. Right? Once the vendor is onboarded, mitigation tactics, remediation efforts, and actual impact of the business over time are going to be the key critical areas that we're going to then try to measure and score, often using concepts like confidentiality, integrity, and availability as a way to break down those. Another area here that's critical across the two different groups is how we actually determine what vendors are critical, and then out those vendors, what vendors pose a high residual risk to the organization. In order to do that, we have to track our risks over time. We have to make sure that we have an influencing score that speaks that same common language as we spoke to earlier, based on the different business actions and the ongoing uses and associated value of the product and service. Another thing to think about here is to make sure that we consider the totality of the overall third parties that we use. The total vendor count from a SaaS perspective, especially, needs to be in line with today's business objectives, right? We need to be able to understand how many vendors are across our organization, which one of those are critical, which one of those pose high residual risk to the organization, and be able to monitor that continuously over time in order to be able to see how our overall footprint and exposure to cyber and external threats, as well as our overall footprint and exposure to internal risks, change and manipulate, and have a tool in place to continuously monitor those residuals. Integrating IT and third-party risk concepts and teams is a scenario where high tides raise all ships, where we can enhance your job function that ultimately enables you to do your job better, regardless of which one of these departments that you sit into. By integrating these two functions, we can reduce data latency and manual errors, improve processing times, trigger cross-functional notifications and automation, and enhance those cross-functional automations and notifications. One of the most critical pieces of any effective governance, risk, compliance, or third-party program is to ensure that you have multiple different teams working in tandem, but in a way that is efficient and scalable and actually practical to the bottom line. And so a digital trust platform like OneTrust allows us to be able to start to deploy in an automated fashion and in an operationalized fashion many of the different concepts that we've discussed in today's presentation. Team, I really appreciate everybody's time today. I wanted to make sure that we ended it about the 45-minute mark in order for time for any questions. I think we'll have just a couple of other areas that ISF wants to touch on just before the top of the hour. But what we'll do now is turn it over to any questions that we may have. All righty, fantastic. So we've got some questions in the chat here, and I'll just go through them from top down. First one here is, what are some of the common roadblocks you've seen a customer experience in aligning different risk domains with TPRM? Great question. That was asked at 8:27. That may have been just before I talked in detail around the scoring methodologies across those two teams, but that is often a critical piece, right? That's often a big pain point in transformation, right? So if you have a third-party risk team, a financial risk team, an IT risk team, and let's say the different sub-functions that are just related to those risks, so accounting team, a development team, etc., they're almost always speaking that different language, right? They almost always have different methods to score it, right? A great example is a lot of privacy teams that use the matrices associated to the CNIL in France use a 5x5 scoring methodology, and then a lot of InfoSec organizations that use the ISO 31000 risk management concept use a different scoring model. So a tool like OneTrust is able to bring those two different scoring models together, actually have a common number or a common weight to those different risks, but then in a reporting process, be able to then break those down into the different ways in which a team has communicated over time. But without doing that in a centralized tool, That is a huge hurdle to cross. Either one team loses, so to speak, and they have to adopt the other team's risk scoring methodology, or both teams have to completely reinvent the wheel, which causes friction and causes concern across how they are able to interpret historical data and historical risk trends that they've previously identified and monitored. And so a tool like OneTrust is able to store the historical data, translate it to other risk concepts, and then be able to score in a common way. So every time a risk is flagged, I'm able to see it at a centralized scoring view that all teams understand, and then break down the different concepts back to those different stakeholders that need a different element associated to it. Great question. What is another touch point of perspective where IT and TPM reporting can align? Fantastic. So another area there is going to be, for reporting, is going to be when we're presenting our overall findings to our chairs, to our boards, to our executive committees, right? Often you're going to see a need for collaboration across the third-party risk function and the IT risk function, right? In OneTrust, what we've done is we've designed 3 different reporting formats in order to be able to meet the different levels of granularity. At the highest level, we have visualized widgets that use macro data concepts and trends that an executive committee or a steering committee may want to see. Next level down is we have executive summary style PDF reports, which allows us to pull in both IT risk data as well as third-party risk data into one single summarized report that's still fairly high level in nature, that starts to break down more granular areas. And then finally, we have column-based Excel style, very detailed reports, typically used and executed by middle management. In terms of what data those hold, that's common across third-party and IT risk management. That is typically going to be the overall enterprise risk that both the different security and third-party risks roll up into, as well as then breaking it down into how the IT security team is mitigating certain functions, how the procurement or the third-party team is mitigating certain functions. And of course, the level of detail you go into really depends on the audience associated to that. Great question. Fragmented third-party perspectives. Sorry, next question here is fragmented third-party perspectives. Where is IT security mentioned, or even the extended enterprise team? And we'll try to answer that question. I might ask if we just reword that one a little bit. But the core concept of the overall presentation and what we're trying to achieve with an overall single digital trust platform at OneTrust is to ensure that the different specific goals and objectives and some of the unique areas of the business are still siloed and are from a user interface perspective, and different enterprise teams, whether they work in IT security, third-party risk, privacy compliance, environmental and sustainability initiatives, no matter what that particular function may be, they're going to have very specific requirements that they may want to follow, siloed in their own single user interface. But the data that they input, when appropriate, is then shared with other teams that also need to know that particular information or need to understand the activity that other group is undertaking. And please post again in the chat if I didn't hit that question directly there, of course. All right, wonderful. So how would you recommend enforcing compliance life cycles towards large companies such as Cisco and Microsoft? Fantastic question. I am a big believer that the core concepts apply to both small and large organizations. The core concepts that we've discussed today and are not just based on any kind of just academia reading that we've done. This is based on what we've seen across the different markets and across the different businesses. Now, OneTrust executes these processes in these automated operational ways from your mom and pop startup that has 5 employees to organizations like Cisco that are active customers of the platform. So while it's a bit of a loaded topic, we can go down a lot of rabbit trails on how do we manage specific compliance life cycles. I'm sure compliance and legal teams on the phone today will have a lot of opinions on that. The core concepts of synergy, the core concepts associated to having single workflow initiatives for different levels of criticality in the business is applicable to an organization the size of Microsoft, as it would be applicable to an organization the size of OneTrust, as it would be an organization the size of my neighbor's power washing organization. Obviously, the exposure and the details and the amount of data is dramatically different. Of course, I'm certainly not suggesting that my neighbor's power washing business and Microsoft have the same issues and challenges at hand. However, the core concepts of synergy are identical. What basic information requirements would you recommend imposing to suppliers? Something like a checklist. Great question. So one thing that OneTrust uses and leverages quite heavily, and we have a very close partnership with this organization, is the SIG assessment from the Standard Assessment Organization. So that's the standard information gathering capabilities. So it is a checklist per se, but what those assessments do is that they're embedded in the OneTrust tool and they operate dynamically. So you can start off with some basic information security questions based on SIG standards, based on ISO standards, for any of our US audience members, based on NIST standards, right? But what you want to make sure that checklist does is that it is more dynamic. And so based on the initial responses to the vendor's information security questions, additional questions or additional checklist items should reveal themselves for the vendor to continuously answer. You're also going to want to make sure that checklist is dynamic in the sense that it's able to be collaborated on, because very rarely do you have one contact at a business that knows the answers to all the areas of information system security. I've actually never seen that before, right? That one person's like, yep, got it. I know exactly all these answers accurately, and I can provide all the evidence associated to it. So making sure that it's collaborated across multiple different areas of that business and shared but secure at the same time, critical. That's a key design piece of the OneTrust vendor assessment capabilities. And then finally, we want to make sure that whatever is happening with the checklist and how they're answering yes, no, or selecting from multiple choices, or selecting particular functions that they have from a security perspective, we want to make sure that that then flags gaps automatically to other areas of the team. So a great example is you send, I'll use your vernacular here, the checklist out, right? It's dynamic, it increases it, it provides additional data points, additional questions based on initial responses. It's being worked on across multiple different members of the third-party team, right? But as they're answering yes or no to questions, risks are flagged associated to the evidence wasn't actually attached to this particular question in any sense, and so we need to flag a gap. Or push back on the particular respondent to provide more details and more data to prove out their response of yes. If they answer no, then we need it to be communicated to, for example, the IT risk management team automatically that if procurement still decides to go with this vendor, this gap in their security program either needs to be mitigated by internal processes, or the IT risk management team needs to have the system and the internal power to override the decision to bring that third party into the organization. Great question. So I know I took a yes, no question and I turned it into something very, very long. Yes, something like a checklist is appropriate, but it needs to be a lot more advanced than what a lot of audience members might think in terms of just 10 questions. Yes, I follow ISO, for example. It's got to be more dynamic than that. And so in order for that to be efficient, you need an automated dynamic assessment tool. Which risk framework would you recommend using, and should actually all teams involved in TPRM be instructed about the framework? Great question. Totally loaded question too. No matter what framework I suggest, I promise you there'll be a lot of people that have differing opinions. Some very, very good foundational areas to start off in, and which I'd recommend, is the NIST 830 risk foundations. That's more common. I see that more common in North America than I do in Europe. The ISO 31000 concepts as well. Very, very good concepts to apply there. ISO is going to be a little bit more, NIST is going to be a little bit more information security centric, but both are very good starting points. However, there's a lot of other frameworks out there that incorporate some very, very good measurements. And there's also other concepts and capabilities, like, for example, some of the COSO frameworks we see out there do a very good job of incorporating a lot of risk concepts They may miss a little bit of the details in information security, but they do a good job of expanding it across a lot of business functions and operational type risks far beyond information security, right? So I'm giving a lawyer answer here of a maybe or depends, but definitely take a look at some of those foundational principles and some of those frameworks that I mentioned. It really is going to be about, what your business or what your organization really executes in to be able to make an informed decision unique to your organization. But the second half of your question, yes, absolutely. Regardless of what you choose, that second piece, in my opinion, should be a non-negotiable. Because if a third-party risk management team is truly enabling the overall risk management practice of the business and ultimately the ability to mitigate risk impact and the frequency of that impact occurring for the bottom line, then they have to be embedded in the overall risk function, which means they really can't get away with not understanding what holistic framework that particular business is using to achieve that. Right, so sorry, I know I gave you kind of a wishy-washy answer at the first part of your question, but hopefully that was quite a direct answer for the second part there. And last question here, guys, because I know Francesca just wants to add a couple of pieces here. Shouldn't a risk owner be the person that is requiring collaboration with third party, IT information security, helping with the formulated risk? I like the idea of having a dedicated, directly responsible individual for risk mitigation and risk ownership. But I think in reality, often there have to be directly responsible teams with specific tasks or initiatives associated to those individuals. Because often when you actually look at the totality of most of the business risks that we face, it's rare that one individual has all the access and the power and the ability to execute on all the processes that would effectively mitigate that risk. So while I think on paper, conceptually, it's nice to have a directly responsible risk owner, it needs to be broader teams. I hope that answered your question. I'll pause here because Francesca, I know you need a couple minutes at the end here. My friends, it was lovely to talk to you today. Hopefully there was some nice nuggets of information to take away to other practices. If anyone has any interest, please feel free to reach out to me and learning more about the OneTrust platform and our digital trust capabilities holistically across these different domain areas that we spoke about. And I'll pass you back over to Francesca.
Thank you, Sam, for a very interesting presentation and for answering the questions. To find out more about future ISF webinars, events, and more insightful content, please visit securityforum.org. Again, if you've missed anything from this webinar and would like to rewatch it, it'll be available on demand on our ISF Bright Talk channel. If you've enjoyed today's session, please feel free to leave a 5-star rating down below. Thank you again, Sam, and thank you everyone for listening. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.